What is good, Osiris? Here, stuck in the middle. You know, if you see an upload, it's 9 a.m. Mountain Time. This video, I want to get into critical race theory. This is Mark Lamont Hill, and he's asking the basic question, and that's all I want to talk about in this video. What is critical race theory?
So joining me now is Dr. Imani Perry, Professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. Professor Perry, I'll say Dr. Perry. I know they say PhDs come a dime a dozen. I don't buy that. So I'm going to say your expertise matters. And I'm going to ask you very clearly, what is critical race theory?
Okay.
What is critical race theory, Doc?
Thank you for having me. So the most straightforward way to explain critical race theory is to begin with the civil rights movement, right? So the victories of the movement, which we all know, are found in federal legislation, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, but also in anti-discrimination law, essentially laws that declared Jim Crow policies unconstitutional. So after that moment, we begin to understand, of course, that Black people suffered many other forms of injury and had many systems of disadvantagement and inequality in their lives, right? And so legislatures and municipalities and organizations began to make specific efforts to target African Americans with programs to address current and past discrimination. And they faced a major conservative backlash. And the way that backlash was formed was saying, well, if you make programs to target the discrimination experienced by Black Americans and you don't include me, white person, then you are discriminating against me. Right. And so they begin to attack programs like affirmative action and upward bound, et cetera. And the Supreme Court of the United States then really fails the civil rights movement by basically treating targeted programs to address racial inequality as the same form of discrimination as Jim Crow laws, right? That they are both are subject to immediate scrutiny, the strictest scrutiny. So, okay, so we get to this point, and then civil rights lawyers and scholars begin to talk about how we have to be able to address subordination, injustice, not just color consciousness. It's not enough to be colorblind. We actually have to be able to address injustice and subordination if we're going to have legal racial equality. And that's the heart of critical race theory. How to think about law, legislation, policies that will substantively respond to racial inequality. And they began to bring multiple forms of analysis to the table: history, narrative, gender, class, showing all the insidious ways that discrimination and inequality have been sedimented in American society, right? And then it blooms in multiple directions, but it is literally just a way of understanding the mechanics of racial inequality and how the law might be imagined to address them. Nothing more than that.
So that was about as clear as molasses. And you get that from things that spawn out of academia. They are so enthralled, and that's why, in my opinion, Mark Lamont Hill was so giddy, is that he had a fellow PhD on the interview on the TV show with him, and they agree on everything, and it's like a club. And this whole critical race theory, I'm not going to get into the history too much on this one. That's a whole separate video, just the history of this thing with Derek Bell and how that spawned from the legal community at Harvard years ago in the 70s. That's a different video. But when you have something spawned from the elites in society, this is not just white elites, these are Black elites, it sounds like gunk. They can't even talk to you like a normal person, and I don't think they want to. They have to they're separated from you. And in my opinion, they feel like they're better than you. And that is the origin, to me, of critical race theory. When somebody asks you, what is critical race theory, you damn well better have an answer. Especially if you're going to go on TV and debate Mark Lamont Hill or debate somebody on this. Not that you're going to want to answer, but you need to know what the answer is. And what I mean by that is what these people do who are into leftist politics is they like to get you into a battle of semantics. You gotta stay away from that. So let's look at her answer, her molasses. I asked for what is critical race theory. She went on for like 2 minutes just talking about the history, and I don't know, maybe it's just me, but to me it was just like, I don't even know what you're talking about. Just tell me what it is. Talk to me like a normal person, not like I'm a PhD, expert in critical race theory. Speak to me in layman's terms. But what she did, she went through, I took some notes. She began with the civil rights movement history. After the movement, blacks still suffered history. Specific efforts were done to target black Americans in a good way, like affirmative action, and those were attacked and deemed as the same form of discrimination as Jim Crow. Still all history, how to address subordination injustice, that it came out of the legal community, all history. She finally got down to the answer when she said, critical race theory is a way of understanding mechanics of racial inequality and how the law might be imagined to address them. And I don't know what happened with Dr. Imani Perry. I have no idea what happened with her, but that was a terrible answer. It is a very difficult thing to answer. The question of what is critical race theory is not easy to answer. If Mark Lamont Hill asked me what critical race theory was, I would tell him it's like porn. It's like obscenity. I'll know it when I see it. It's all encompassing. Literally, it's all encompassing. It is such a vast topic. It's hard to even do an elevator pitch for it. And what I would say is, I wouldn't debate Mark Lamont Hill on critical race theory. Number one, he's more well-read than I am. But that's not my area of motivation. There are things happening in our society now that shouldn't be happening. And I have tangible examples. So Mark Lamont Hill, here's what I'd like to do. I don't care what you label these things here, and I'll do that in another video, but I have a problem with them. And here's why. You tell me, are you okay with this? I do that all the time on Twitter, because on Twitter, they like to do that battle of semantics. What's CRT? No, that's not CRT. And it's like, wait. I'm just looking at this issue. Is this good or bad for our country? You're not even talking about the issue. The way I would describe critical race theory in a succinct manner would be to say it is a bunch of ideas, opinions that are used to justify viewing everything that happens in our country through the lens of racism. That's what critical race theory is. And you got to really dig into that, because the language that they use is not the normal language. The way they use racism is not the way normal people have always used racism. Let me give you the pillars that I'm taking from critical race theory. Number one, race is socially constructed. That's what people who believe in critical race theory feel. Ryan Chapman laid it out so perfect.
Critical race theorists examined America and concluded that racism is a pillar that holds up American society to the extent that America is a regime of white supremacy. That the word white here isn't necessarily used in the way that we normally think of it, because it doesn't necessarily correlate with your skin color. So they think that since the norms of America are fundamentally white, anyone whose values are reflected in those norms and anyone who benefits from them and becomes successful within the regime of these norms may effectively also be white. Because again, this is an argument that's grounded in integration. And if anyone integrates into the status quo, they might be called by critical race theorists white, regardless of their skin color.
The idea of race is subjective. It's not objective, and it's not built in biology. That's what it means by socially constructed. Very similar to gender, and how gender is being viewed. Someone on Twitter a while back called Candace Owens a white supremacist. and I was ignorant to the whole critical race. It wasn't that long ago. I was ignorant to the whole backstory of it, and I hadn't read into it. I'm much more read into it now, and I understand what happened. I would be considered a white supremacist by many. It has nothing to do with skin color. They could identify you as a white supremacist if you lean with what they think is the racist structure of our country. You are a white supremacist. It doesn't matter what your background is. In Black America, it is not uncommon for someone to say you talk white or you act white, maybe as a joke or maybe being serious. This is really the PhD version of legitimizing that statement. Number 2 here out of 6, the United States suffers from endemic racism. That's basically the same as saying the U.S. is suffering a pandemic of racism. It is institutionalized racism. Everything about our country is racism from this founding all the way up till now. Is we are integrated in racism. It is so ingrained in our culture that people consider it invisible, but still there.
Critical race theorists examined America and concluded that racism is a pillar that holds up American society to the extent that America is a regime of white supremacy. That includes most American institutions and most aspects of American life, like our laws, our education system, our culture, our economic system, and our politics, which is all generally shortened by critical race theorists down to being called the status quo. So critical race theorists believe that the status quo of America is the status quo of white supremacy. But it's not an explicit white supremacy. They believe it kind of hangs in the minds of white Americans in a subconscious kind of Freudian way, where white Americans are kind of conditioned into a white supremacist mindset without necessarily being consciously aware of it.
There's a quote that went around. There's a quote that a lot of people had retweeted and has gone around in the circles. Racism is so American that when you protest it, people think you are protesting America. These are not my thoughts. I'm just laying out what critical race theory is. Number 3, in contemporary American society, the unique voice of color serves important purposes. That means if you are a person of color, again, that does not include me because of my beliefs. I put country first. I judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. That statement is against critical race theory. Critical race theorists do not agree with that statement. But that third piece is voice of color, meaning that your anecdotal stories are not to be challenged, and they are proof of racism. Saying, hey, you hailed a taxi, and the taxi didn't stop, and nobody was in it, and the taxi kept on moving. You do not have any proof that that was because of race, but if you perceive it was because of race, then it is racism. If you challenge someone and say, well, you don't have proof, then you are part of the racist integration of our country, and you are discredited. Again, not my beliefs, but that is critical race theory, in my opinion. Differential racialization. This is the academia fancy way of just saying stereotypes. They believe in stereotypes, and that stereotypes change over time. The other part of it is that stereotypes are there to benefit those in power and control. Intersectionality. This is a big one. And what that means is if I'm Black and I'm gay, then I have 2 oppressed identities in me. And it creates a hierarchy of who has the more oppressed intersectional groups within them.
To say that, like, I think white women need to kind of step up their game, to be quite honest. Like, sorry, but I'm calling you out. Like, You really do, because there's I couldn't agree more with everything that these brilliant women are saying, but I'm also seeing the silent killer, which is a lot of white women at the top who are kind of reinforcing a lot of old ideas.
If you're now thinking, what the hell are you talking about? You haven't spent much time on a modern college campus. Intersectionality is a form of identity politics in which the value of your opinion depends on how many victim groups you belong to. At the bottom of the totem pole is the person everybody loves to hate, the straight white male. And who's at the top? Well, it's very hard to say because new groups claim victim status all the time. No one can keep track. So, how does this intersectionality thing play out? Something like this. Let's say you're a gay white woman.
As a queer woman,
your opinion matters, but less than that of a gay black woman. Why? Because while all women are oppressed by the patriarchy, and all gays are oppressed by the heterosexual majority, blacks have a victim status that whites obviously don't.
The guy at the top's louder. It's harder to say, I think this should be a black writer.
Of course, a gay black woman's victim status is less than that of a black trans woman, who ranks below a black Muslim trans woman, and so on. The more memberships you can claim in oppressed groups, the more aggrieved you are, and the higher you rank. Get it? Good, because it's about to get even more complicated. Intersectionality takes your victim status and uses it as the basis for creating alliances with other victim groups.
I'll just speak from my own personal experience. It's just I wasn't sure how to be an ally. I wasn't sure what type. I got so caught up in what kind of terminology I was supposed to be using.
Here's the logic. A black gay and a Hispanic gay may not belong to the same victim group racially, but they do belong to the same victim group on the basis of their sexuality. By focusing on the places where various victim identities intersect, intersectionality creates a united us versus them paradigm.
And the last one is interest conversion. What they're really saying is people in power, those in power, like I talk about the establishment all the time, those in power are not going to do anything out of the kindness of their heart. So those in power are not going to fight for social justice out of the kindness of their heart.
Determinism is the idea that racism provides advantage to the dominant group. Given this, how can progressive change be accomplished? Well, let's start by thinking of an example. So Brown versus Board of Education ended the separate but equal policies that denied African Americans and other minority groups access to resources from drinking fountains to housing. So according to Dr. Derek Bell, who put forth the idea of interest convergence, Brown versus Board of Education only passed because it was in the interest of America at that particular time to show the world and the Soviet Union in particular that we supported civil and human rights. So progressive change is possible when it comes to racial justice, but only when those in power, and in this case white Americans, think that there is something to gain from it for themselves. In other words, the interests of those in power and Americans of racial and ethnic minority background must be the same in order for change to take place.
They have to have a motivation. So when the motivation of the social justice warriors intersects with the motivation, well, the motivation here might be different, but when there's motivation here to get something done, and then for social justice warriors, that's when it gets done, is when those two moments in overlap. So the other part of interest conversion is the means justify the ends. So that in order to force the establishment to act, you justify. This is why just riots are justified. That's why any action is justified. Kneeling during the anthem is, of course, okay and justified. If it brings attention, if it does this interest conversion. So that's it. That's basically what critical race theory is. Just to summarize, it's those 6 pieces. I'm going to read them off to you. Race is socially constructed. Our country is ingrained in racism. Every aspect of it is racist. In American society, the voice of color serves important purposes and is not to be questioned, else you are racist. 4, differential racialization. This describes the meaning of socially constructed races basically stereotypes and how that changes over time to serve those in power. Number 5, intersectionality, where you are breaking everybody up into identity groups, and you might be in more than one of those groups. And typically, if you're in more than one of those groups, it gives you a louder voice of color. And the last one, interest conversion, when those in power have the proper motivation, that's when action is going to be taken. And all of this, the end goal is to abolish racism and to end oppression. It's a brilliant end goal because the end goal is obviously impossible. It's impossible to end racism. So that ensures that this theory will never end. Why is this important? The moment that we're in our country right now, the last time that we've been in this moment where we are right now in the United States of America was 1860. And the Mason-Dixon line won't be the dividing factor. It will be critical race theory. Let me know what you think. Take care.